We have the panel on forecast and not to forecast, and we have with us a set of experts across multiple industries who are going to help us understand this whole process, dynamics of forecasting. And I would like to invite Anirudh Srivastava, Head of Demand and Supply Planning, Mahindra & Mahindra. Anirudh, can you please? Srinivas Rao Nandigam, Global Head of Supply Chain, Sun Pharmaceutical Industries. Pawan Mundada, Global Planning Hub Leader, General Mills India. Pawan. Deepta Gopal, National Head Supply Planning, Hindustan Coca-Cola Beverages Limited. Sandeep Satapathy, Head Global Supply Chain Management, Profit Center Operations of Tata Steel. Vishwanathan Rajamanikam, Head Business Planning, Henkel Adhesives. Aniruddha Karnataki, Vice President Supply Chain of Seat Tires. Milind Kandekar, Director Supply Chain Planning Practices, Chain Analytics. Shanmukh Singh, a consultant at SCM. And to lead the panel, we will have Dr. Rakesh Singh back again. Dr. Singh, the forum is yours.
Let's start straight away with issues in today's demand planning world. As far as forecasting is concerned, I gave you my view. I think that should not be the view. Right? We need to have multiple views, and I don't know how to start because I spoke too much, right? But let us start with someone who practices demand forecasting in a big way, provide some global data to a consumer FMCG company. So Pawan, I'll start with you. I wanted a complete view on what is the role of forecasting. Let me not use the title as to start with, it will just conclude then. But what is the role of forecasting today, how it has changed, and in what way it's going to be a part of demand planning?
Well, okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much. It's an interesting dynamic that we are in, and I represent General Mills, so we come from a CPG industry, consumer packaged good industry. And I know the last 2 years, 3 years, the pandemic has been very different to every industry that you're a part of. Everybody's challenges have been different when it comes to forecasting and demand planning. But my point of view would be more from what CPG industry globally we went through and where we are seeing the future to be with forecasting. First of all, just a brief on a minute maybe or 30 seconds on where we were just before pandemic hit us and where we are now and what we have been through. I think we had a very good seat and we have worked very hard to have a seat on the table when it comes to conversations on forecasting, demand planning, IDP, SNOP, you name it, or SNOE. And things look pretty good. There was a lot of willingness to embrace technology, to embrace data, to embrace segmentation, stat forecasting as an input into forecasting and demand planning process. Suddenly pandemic happened, COVID struck, and today where we are, the same people who were embracing it now are questioning the very essence of is your data really good, is your forecast really good, and in every way they are right in questioning that because our history that we used to use is so distorted now that it is not a good base for us to do what we used to do. So the model that we had, which were running extremely well for us, the forecasting process that was running very well for us, suddenly is getting challenged left, right, and center, and everything needs to change. It's not only the models that need to change, it's also the process that needs to change, it's the people's mindset that needs to change, the conversations that we have that need to change. So as an organization, and I take this in a much more broader context, not only forecasting in a narrow lens, but I think change management as overall in an organization needs a stimulus, needs a step change to embrace a lot of these things, to accept and acknowledge the realities of today and to embrace what's coming next. So time series used to be the way forecasting used to be done, like Professor said, yes. But now there is an extremely bigger need to have causal factors in. They are not good enough. Time series isn't really good enough in majority of the instances. And causal factors, now in a lot of countries, in a lot of regions, data collection, data availability, and authenticity is also a challenge. So how do you take that and still make sense out of it? So yes, forecasting overall is here to stay. Forecasting is still the way. There is no alternative to it in an organization because you need it for a lot of planning related activities. But the way we are doing it has certainly gone a sea change in the last 2 to 3 years. And we are still in the process of knowing how to do this. We are still seeing across industries how everybody is doing it, connecting with academia to say how to do it better and what's coming in the future. Are we what we are doing today good enough, or we need to do something else? So I think it is still a process. We are still trying to make sure that the conversations change, segmentation, demand, not only forecast, but because we cannot forecast everything, that's the reality. And that's where we are bringing in segmentation as a conversation on the table with every party concerned to say, this is where we can, this is where we cannot, and this is where you got to have more enriched conversation to take this forecast out. But yes, causal factors are, we are leveraging them incredibly high now compared to what we used to make sure, and we are moving towards probabilistic forecasting to say what lies there, because we can't be doing what we did, and that's not good enough. And that's why it's an interesting dilemma. We are trying to do probabilistic, we are trying to do causal, but at the same time, there is a lot of pull to say, let's do less of forecasting and do more of listen to us more, correct? Because the market realities are different. So I think it's an interesting situation and dynamic to be in, and that's it.
All right, I think you have brought about final points of forecasting and moving towards segmentation and causal factor. I think these are all trends that needs to be captured and seen together. So let me come to Sandeep. I think Sandeep comes from a steel industry, and like I was reading something in Wall Street Journal which says that just because of inflation factor in US and European Union, the retail demands have gone down by 25 to 30%. One of the causal factor happens to be just inflation. I think inflation has so many causal variables, but that's another way to look at it. What has been the impact of external factors and causal factor on demands planning in your organization?
Yeah. Since I think everything Dr. Rakesh Singh has covered in the first 10 minutes, I think not left anything for us to say in that issue. But I'll just give you some perspective of how our businesses we are running. See, I will not use much of the jargons of the forecasting, because forecasting is required for your day-to-day businesses as well as for your growth plans, etc. How you capture that? There is a paradigm shift from your traditional style of forecasting to what we have discussed a few minutes back. So now, when I talk about any business head, I was just sharing a little before to someone. Any business head, because supply chain, as you know, it was always a back-end business, but now last almost 10 years, a decade, it is a boardroom discussion. So all your bottom lines are actually driven by supply chain, because ultimately the sales team can only capture the demand and they can sell if they fixed, the margins, they cannot do doubling of your margins. So whatever efficiency has to come, it has to come to the supply chain from end to end, I'm talking about. So in that context, in the demand planning, how today you are capturing your demand. So everything has been talked about. That it is the question right now. If I put it in a simple term, it's a real demand plan, real term. So how do you arrive at it? That's technological advancement has gone into the place. Dr. Singh has already talked about that. We are also part of that 95% bracket of using Excel also. But Excel is what? Once you get download of your all analysis, then you play in the Excel. But you can't churn the data in the Excel. So for that, a lot of technological advancement has come. So we all know that without technology, nothing will move. He already talked about a slide from McKinsey that 4 simple, that how do you automate a lot of sensors, etc. So when I talk about the sensors, these are something, what is the market sensor you are putting into. So that is what I am saying, that today these big jargons of this technology that we are talking about cloud computing. In the logistics front, cloud computing is massively used to bring down your costs. Talk about, he already spoken about big data analytics. He just touched up to the point, and really it is being used because n number of data, n number of assets in the retail chain, because every transaction is being done in the entire supply chain up to delivering the customers. We generate huge amount of data. How to sense those data to get a meaningful your forecasting? The way every organization has a different way to forecast, because in the real demand sense they have to see, since Tata Steel is a big company, but right now I right now responsible for a profit center. So a number has been given that this much exports has to be achieved this month or next month, etc. as a part of your plan. So one has to, this supply chain has to back calculate from that bottom line number to arrive at how they plan the entire, whether it is sourcing, whether it is manufacturing, how much working capital you need to keep, because major sense is the working capital, because today working capital is the answer. So what is working capital? Again, how much inventory you keep into the system as far as the supply chain is concerned, and how do you supply to your customer that your debt remains under control? Because you have input terms to your various customers, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. So I am trying to emphasize upon that business need today is how you amalgamate your lot of external factor into.
Yeah.
So the one thing we started practicing in our human resource department, I'm little digressing, but it is linked to the matter, that the agile behavior we call it. Because in the real demand planning, if you don't have an agile behavior in the entire organization, then you can't achieve those numbers. Agile behavior in the sense you have to have agility in the entire systems. You have to have a collaborative, which are a very common terms, but it has to be used. Unless until you accountable somebody and agility is there. Like today they say this much you have to produce, tomorrow there is something happened in that particular region and the number has to be used. So I am only saying that agile behavior of the company also determines that how you achieve those numbers and how you capture your
Point well taken. And
thanks.
I think let's move to a core question of forecasting. And as I said, as Pawan said, and you also said, there is a need to look into more external factors into the forecasting, largely causal factors. And how many organizations do that, and in what ways are they using it to make forecasting sensible? And I think I'm opening up. Anyone can take up and start talking on this. That would be much better to start. Yeah.
No, it's a fantastic question. So, and a lot has been said. What you said is that there is a lot of data which we need to send. Even the McKinsey 4.0, which you said. And given the context of the ability to capture data, which has actually increased so much today, one part is about analytics, but the other part is about actually ability to capture data. Allows us to make real-time forecasting so much easier. Let me give you a very simple example. How many of you people actually, when you traveled to this place in the morning, drove down, actually looked up on the Google Maps, what is the time for you to kind of reach here? Can I have a raise of hand? Yeah, I see a huge number of them, yeah? And that Google Maps is actually capturing real-time data to see how many people are on the road, what is happening. It gives you the red signal, the green signal, and the yellow signal, and a variety of signals. So this is about actually ability to capture data has actually increased so much. Now, perhaps we in supply chain also have to open up our minds to not just about computing data and finding different models to be able to kind of fine-tune that data to move from, let's say, a probabilistic to a probabilistic model. Yeah, but my submission would be to actually look at how do we capture the data.
And there are various technologies which are available today to be able to capture data, starting from whether it's a weather input, whether it is a COVID, whether it is, there are hundreds of causal factors as people say, but what we tend to forget is that this world has improved in terms of ability to capture data dramatically, multifold, whether it is the Google Lens or whether it is your, speech data or hundreds of things. Yeah, I mean, people are able to capture those data. And I can tell you about one example of retail. If a consumer, she has gone to a particular aisle, picked up that particular item twice or thrice and 4 times and actually kept it back, it's not a good point of sale, item for the company. So that's the data which people are capturing today to say that whether we actually give more inputs in terms of creating that, or in terms of the point of sale and so on and so forth. So I just want to leave the thought that the real-time forecasting, there is a huge ability which we have already in the world to be able to capture the data and dovetail that into our analytics and models. So that's the only thing which I want to kind of leave the thought with.
I think all planning is about data and models, right?
Yes.
And if it is, then there's one factor that I think came up in Pong's this thing, and I'm just going to put it to everybody here. What happens when the global macroeconomy, the global pandemic, and any such disruption takes place? How do we use this external understanding in our forecasting? How are you going to really build those models, and how are you going to use them into whole thing? One thing is that the data is available, but one fundamental thing that happened during the Suez Canal crisis is that nobody knew what to do us. Everybody has all kind of control towers, but nobody could provide that kind of a analysis. And I think nobody knew what kind of ships move. That's the number of ships on anchorage that were there. What were alternative multimodal routes that were available, right? So those are issues. But more than that, as we revert back, how is this global macroeconomy defining? How do you build them into your, forecasting? Because this is one factor. As I said, inflation has been influencing retail demand all over the world, including India. If you see some data for the June, you are clearly indicative of that particular distance. So how do you factor in your planning? And I've been saying this because over a period of time, we have been talking about external factors, outside-in approaches, but those outside-in approaches are very, very specific to orders. And I think, how do you capture this? Anyone?
So I'll just give you people an example. The global inflation, and I used to work for Unilever when the 2008 issue of this recession happened. And while everybody was saying that this is the doomsday which is coming up and so on and so forth, people in Unilever thought that this is actually a right thing to happen, because when there is this global inflation which is happening, there are a lot of people who actually have got their EMIs which is going out of their pockets, and the income rates are going up, so the disposable income from their pocket is actually coming down. Yeah, and therefore, people will buy less. The contrarian theory to that is that because there is going to be a global recession, people want to make themselves feel more happy and spend more on the disposable income and the experiences, and therefore that industry can grow. So there will be both sides to this. I am not an expert on actually.
No, I think the same data says very interesting thing as you're saying. They say they have cut expenses on consumption in the European and the US,
yes.
And they have started using it for travel to cheaper economies, and the travel expenses have gone much higher.
That's something we saw in the beverages industry this year. It was, we call it revenge shopping and revenge partying and revenge going out. So we saw unprecedented demand for which we were not prepared for. Absolutely zero preparation, because after 2 years of COVID, which has disrupted and which has erased our entire history, we didn't know how to react to this kind of a crisis. So coming back to the topic of our discussion, I feel forecasting is now in the post-COVID era, it is more relevant now than ever, for especially for FMCG and retail markets, retail manufacturers, because however the technology behind forecasting, we need to invest in the technology behind forecasting to become more agile, like he said, capture real-time data. The purpose would be to collect that information, with all this demand sensing and stuff like that, evaluate it, recalibrate and respond. So gone are the days where we close the demand 1 month in advance and then we have those monthly plans and monthly SNOP meetings. So it's not going to work that way anymore. It has to be real-time scenario plannings and more agile planning so that we are able to respond to changes in the customer sentiments and the dynamics, global macroeconomics, as he said. And more than ever, companies that are purely looking at only internal data are going to have a blind spot in predicting future crises of this sort. If we have to limit the impact of any future crisis or overcome any future crisis, we have to look at external points of data as well, of data gathering and information gathering as well. So forecasting is now more relevant than ever, but we have to change the way and change the tools that we use and the technology that we use to forecast future events and make sure they are predictable and more conducive to how we plan.
Yeah, so one of the things that we see, right, which is, like Sir said, technology is getting more democratized, data is getting more democratized. For example, weather patterns only once upon a time when only the Met department had access to that kind of data. Today you probably have R or a Python plugin where you can get all that data and the data scientist within your organization can give you any kind of a weather pattern, right? One thing that we see is that there is a lot of excitement about now starting to use these technologies, put it into our planning processes. We see both success as well as some missteps there. And fundamentally, I think what's happening today is, you want to use all these advanced technologies for everything under the sun that you want to plan for. And I think this is where, smart supply chains, they understand how do I better differentiate, how do I better segment. Like Dr. Singh said, if you are still doing your volume-based ABC, those supply chains are probably, still stuck in the 1980s, right? You have to start looking at, is a particular SKU even forecastable? How do I define whether it's forecastable? What kind of variabilities I see, what kind of probability distributions that I see on the demand? That's one. What kind of volumes, what kind of top line these things will contribute to my business, right? And let's say if you have, an extremely variable SKU, extremely variable product with a very low demand. Now, is that something that you want to use all these fancy upcoming technologies to do any forecasting? Probably not. You are going to just waste too much of time your planners trying to look at it, whereas your planners could actually be solving for some of the bigger priorities, bigger challenges within your supply chain. So that's again one thing that we see. Smart supply chains, smart organizations are focusing on that differentiation, that segmentation, to really then drive what they need to drive from a overall planning, from sales and execution perspective.
I think, Milind, you put up a very good point. But one, they will advocate to that. We've seen a lot of people using forecastability as an approach to see the series forecasting ability, or whether they are forecastable. But one of the fundamental challenges that we face with that particular method is that when you start looking at coefficient of variance, standard deviation and mean, I think in fact in forecasting everything comes around that. What you see is that variability is not accuracy issues, and hence what you see in the data series can be dangerous. Maybe the series is forecastable, but because of the business behaviors that are imbibed into that, and it's not being removed, forecastability, it looks like non-focus. So sometimes techniques can blindfold you. And I think this is a very important point. You need to clean that and move towards using these techniques. Yes?
No, absolutely, right? I think it's one of the tools, right? But that's not the only tool. Right? You have to start looking at, is your planning team, providing that value add over the statistical forecast, so to say, that you're creating, right? And how do I define that? how do I understand the biases that are coming? How do I understand then eventually what is my demand plan accuracy? Because the statistical forecast accuracy is just that. Eventually your supply chain is going to run on your demand plan accuracy, which is where I think Deepa was saying, right? Deepa was saying, right? Which is you need an organization which is collaborative. You need the organization that has the ability to assimilate, understand what the demand plan means, and then take it forward, right? Whether it could be a probabilistic demand plan, but at the end of the day, there is one plan, right? And as the late US president once said, right? Plans are nothing. Planning is everything, right? So that's the kind of approach that we see that's kind of going on, especially where there are.
Anything from you on this?
Yeah. So thank you.
Oh, there are two Anirudhs. I meant the other one. Yeah.
Okay, so
then we'll come back to you.
So I'll just maybe add my perspective on it, and just to give you the context, I come from CI, and just to explain the follow-through points, CI is a company which deals into 3 business units. 50% of it is aftermarket, which is as good as any retail, industry, and that's where the topic is so relevant in my mind also. I would look at it this way. I mean, just to answer the question upfront, forecast or not forecast, I guess the answer to me is obvious. You have to forecast it. Why? Because I think Dr. Singh mentioned also in his opening speech, there is something called as lead time, right? So there is a supply lead time, inbound lead time, manufacturing lead time, supply lead time, etc. So there is a certain lead time for you to serve the demand unless you are going to 3D print all your products at the customer doorstep, which is probably not possible in all areas. So that's a very necessity. Also, it's an important thing for governance of all the supply chain efficiencies and service levels, and I guess most of you would understand that. What is important to understand according to me is the level of forecasting. I think when we talk about forecasting within the organization also, a lot of people think this as something which is mysterious, because of things like statistics and data science and those things attached to it, which is, I think, one part of it. What is more important to understand is the level of forecasting. One aspect which again Dr. Singh touched in terms of the geography, skew level of forecasting. And the second is the time span, whether you are forecasting for a 1 month out, 2 months out, or 1 year out, and your accuracies and things like that are going to change. Related to that is also a point about the utility of that forecast. I will not be using a 12-month out forecast for my maybe replenishment planning or for my raw material planning, right? So that's the nuance which needs to be understood. And accordingly the tools and techniques also will change. I think one just example comes to my mind in terms of the accuracy of forecast. When we talk about accuracy of forecast, say for CPG or industrial products and all, how many of us, I guess, or which, I don't know, which maybe financial houses would have predicted Brent at say 120 in maybe March or April. I guess it was in the range of 40 to 60 or 80 for most of the period last maybe 7 or 8 years. But something dramatically changed and it suddenly went up. So these things, and just to answer a previous question on those unpredictable events, I think there are no models to predict it. And I'm just picking up from Dr. Sinha's one of the post that these things are best managed. They are not to be forecasted, they are to be managed tactically. I think most companies have done that quite well in the post-pandemic period last 2 years. So just to maybe summarize, forecasting, yes, it's relevant, but we need to understand the granularity and the tools, techniques and utility of that differs from context to context.
Forecasts are not the decisions. Forecasts helps the decision. The role of forecast is to help you cope with seasonality, with price cutting maneuvers, with consumer sentiments changes, preference changes. The role of forecast is to help you deliver your products just in time to improve your service levels and supply chain performance. We treat forecasts as the end decision. If my forecast comes, I have to produce 200 units, I will produce 200 units. The forecast aids your intuition, and decision making could be intuitive, intelligent, inquisitive, and inclusive. Continuing to the factors that we need to consider all the factors that are available in terms of data, in terms of qualitative data as well. And continuing from there, we cannot forecast for everything. I do not think so. We can forecast for everything, but the way we forecast and the way we use the forecast, as he said, Anirudh, right? Sorry. It becomes more important.
But that is making a very wild statement that we can forecast everything. What does it mean?
It means when unprecedented conditions come banging on our door, we should forecast. People say, I cannot forecast for the short term, I cannot forecast for the long term. That's not true. We can forecast, but forecasting needs to be used very tactically to build intuitions.
All right. Anyone who disagrees with it, then I can take this forward.
Rishi here from Henkel. Anything can be forecasted is a very tough statement. It's not a straightforward, anybody can accept it. So always forecast comes with a quality, right? It can be forecasted. It's a toss of coin is also, you can take approach. But what is the quality we can achieve is based on situation. The topic, coming back to the topic, forecast or not to forecast. If you see earlier, what we are trying to forecast is like there is too much of disruption. So in automotive industry, there is a semiconductor shortage, which is not very familiar, or it was not known. It was there earlier in 2011 also, but this time it was hitting across all the industry. So if you see every OEM having their booking there, so demand is completely available. If you are able to produce, you are able to sell. What are you forecasting? It is not what is the customer demand, which is not forecasted here. Today the situation is, if you are able to produce, supply or sale is not a question. So the dynamics of the history so far, the data was talking only about what we are able to sell, what customer is looking for, those are the things. Today, the situation is not only coming from demand side of it, supply is also having huge impact on the demand, it is getting shaped. So you are not purely forecasting demand, it's also you are forecasting your customer, in a B2B business, you are forecasting your customer's sellability. So it's a bit of a change. So history is becoming irrelevant in this context. So coming back to the topic, any unprecedented things can be forecasted. It may not be possible at the beginning time, but there are models, there are learning systems which can take the learning from recent happenings as well. So like one small example, like we handle with OEMs and automotive OEMs. So there were situations like COVID-related shutdowns, and due to raw material shortage, due to COVID, we were to shut some customer line. And the important point is, even our customers are very familiar with such scenarios. The important thing what we did is like, okay, this happened, so what are we doing so that in your BCP or business continuity plan, what are you doing so that next time similar thing happens, you are in a better position to handle that. So that's the broad learning we are also taking. There are unprecedented things, but are we learning and improving our systems? We cannot use traditional model. We cannot use our data as we did in the past, because we are not forecasting same what we were forecasting earlier. The constraints are different. The shaping is very much different, and different aspects are shaping our demand. So we need different models. Time series will not be possible to pick those things quickly. It will take longer time and longer history to develop, so it's not going to work. So clearly we are doing a lot of, again, next comes the technology issues. We do a lot of POCs and proof of concepts to evaluate and see the thing, how fast we are able to learn. and incorporate in our forecasting. That's how we are approaching. It's very, as somebody said, like it's a black box approach will be there. So it's important that we are able to take the learning and use it in a shorter area as a proof of concept and then try to roll out. That's how we are doing it. But this period is teaching very much onto this. Anything is forecastable with the quality attached to that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I've heard a lot that the predictability of the situation is very low. But we forget that more things remain same than the things that change in the most unprecedented times. And what do I mean by that? The philosophy of demand forecasting. We need to understand what is demand. Demand is a desire backed by willingness and ability to pay. The desire and the willingness stay, and that's why more things remain same than the things that change. The ability to pay is the major factor in the most unprecedented times, and that's what we need to incorporate in our forecasts.
All right.
Yeah.
I think one comment on that, it really builds up a very strong framework for external factors. Understanding the external factors, what Tanmukh is saying, is important because it really reduces the third element. I think ability to pay by localities, even by localities, because if you look at it in the COVID times, it's not only that it was income that was affected, the shutdown of the places, lockdowns, containment zones, all affected demand in the pattern. But what Visi makes a point is very interesting. He is not denying that we cannot have intelligence to use it to understand. It get constrained. A good word used is constraint, a theory of constraint. Why? Because we often do not incorporate the constraint from the supply chain side into the forecasting. And that limits the availability of goods and services. But if you look at the 3 periods of COVID across the globe, and you look at the data, you can always say that the first period was affected by 65% of the 2019 level. We saw that second period was affected by 35%, and if anything else comes, it will be 25%. I think there is a need to make this judgment. And this is where these judgments play a big role in terms of understanding this. When you have your AI and ML, but I'll leave it to Anirudh to come there and start looking at it because he's very strong at that. So what role do AI ML has in forecasting and redefining forecasting amidst everything what they're saying is uncertainty, right? That's what we're saying.
So, lots of thoughts while I heard everybody speak. I think the fundamental question, let me try and give my perspective on why we should forecast, right? I mean, there's accounts, there's sales, there's operations. You have an organization works in a framework, right? So everybody's trying to figure out what do we need to do. So there's an economic context to why you want to predict demand, right? So one of the first things is I want to know what I'll sell, how much I'll make, because it's my whole performance of my revenue, my cost is dependent on that. So if you have the luxury to make anything and have the luxury of lead time, then you would probably not be under pressure to forecast that much. I have enough lead time to make something. Orders come in, I'll make according to orders. That's awesome. I mean, if you work in that environment, fine. You'd still need to predict your manpower, your capacity and all that, which again requires some input. So you need to understand the economic context of why you need to come up with a number, right? That number may be right, wrong. You can do scenario analysis, and which is what people do. Let me do a practical case, worst case, best case, and I'll have 3 scenarios and I'll work with that. If you make enough margins, so you can overcome the lack of forecasting. So let's say your product makes sufficient margins. So is there a need to forecast it very well? Probably not. You can just stack up so much inventory because cost of carrying goods is not as high as the amount of money you're going to lose in losing your sales. So let me stack so much inventory in my system, build my capacity, my cost of managing operations is much lower. I can make more money per unit by selling, so I'll stock as much as I can. It makes business sense. Yes, it does. We did that when we were not knowing what to plan and what to buy. We just went ahead and bought a lot of stuff and kept it, right? Now, if you're in a very price-sensitive market where your cost of efficiency, everything is to you, then you have enough pressure to now start to build those efficiencies in supply chain, and your accuracy and your inventory have to be low and so on and so forth. So I think the context has to be first put. The technology tools can come afterwards. Second thing, I think time series forecasting is getting a bad rap. We can talk about AI, ML, but understand that all this is statistics and all this is probability. So when you use statistics and probability to make decisions, you need to understand the basics of all these things. And my experience with even mature organizations has been that the fundamental lack of understanding of what these numbers mean and where they're coming from is very limited, even at the high levels in the organization. So just to give you an example, time series is looking at historical data and saying, I have so many data points and I'm going to predict the future. Understand that AI ML, which is being called today, is just a fancy name of something which we used to call regression back in the days. So it's logistic regression, multiple linear regression. I have 5 factors, let me regress and try and find out. Even regression and AI ML requires you to work with history. It's not as if historical data is not needed. So what time series is making it simple and saying, I don't care what factors influence your sale. This is what has happened. So let me take out that ability for you to figure out these 5 different factors. I'm going to give you one answer and that works. AI ML, on the other hand, when you're talking about external factors, macroeconomics, you're talking about commodity prices going up or down, there's a recession in this part of the country. See, all this is great. I think a lot of people use their economic hunches to make decisions about this, right? I'll give you an example in automobile. I am launching a Model X. There's enough competition in the market. I have this much market size, so what should be my price be? So that's where I've seen one factor, maybe 2 factors at best, but people are able to use and say, if I increase my price, what's going to happen? Decrease my price, what's going to happen? Well, the answer to that you already know. It's basic economics, right? The competition is high, you're going to increase your price, your demand is going to drop. People tend to use hypothesis, but they don't validate hypothesis. So what I would suggest is before you get into AI ML and say, my consumer preferences depending on X, Y, and Z, and this is my function is going to be a combination of X, Y, and Z, do test your hypothesis, okay? And for hypothesis testing, you need historical data, and the same data which you're using in the past is going to be used for the future as well. So don't underestimate the power of these tools because they're still using the same fundamental models which use history. So use them, but hypothesize them and test them and validate them. What may be true in one era may not be true in the next era. So let's say you have a product X which has so many variables which you think as working now, 2 years down the line, market dynamics change, some factors become significant, some factors become insignificant. So be careful when you make decisions at that scale using statistics and probability because it comes with a lot of assumptions. So my suggestion is it's great, but make sure that you understand where it's coming from.
I think that's interesting because a lot of people says that how can we use probabilistic forecasting when there's not enough data? Or any intelligent forecasting system where data is not there. I think historical data and data that lies within your organization has enough. There's enough data and quality within that data to be used in probabilistic format. Not only, trying to get out of it. In fact, when you use probabilistic and time series data, there's also a need for breaking the time series component to its causal factors that really drive them. And I think that's missing. We always look at history rather than what has caused that history, because if we can take that into account, some amount of insight can actually come in from the market. Now, we were doing something for Mahindra Tractors long back, and they were doing a regression model with 12 to 15 macroeconomic variables. They got to a sales forecasting marketing consultant. It came as a summer project to a student of mine at NMIMS and I was teaching. And we realized that there was so much of multi-collinearity within the model. And then we realized only 3 factors that drive tractor demand in this country. One is real income of the farmer. The second, the amount of credit that is available through the banking system and through all the players. They have their non-banking financial and the interest rate. Nothing else matters. Now, getting into this is important so that you understand that you don't need 20,000 variables. You need very effective variables. Your R square for this was around 60. That means the 40% what Dr. Sinha says is to be managed by the market uncertainty. You need to build up the supply chain capability. So forecasting helps you to be quite stable to a great extent, and then you build those capabilities right to the market. In fact, Panon, you brought one element very strongly into the debate, segmentation. But I think I will throw that to the audience. And I thought, let's get their views. I see someone there, Sneha. How does segmentation work at HUL? I think we heard you, so that was interesting, and I thought I'd get that into this thing. And Mike, please. We'll come back to the panel right later.
So
I hope I'm right, it was you, right?
Yeah. So for the segmentation, we actually use it in the forecasting bit also, and for the whole supply chain planning area. The very first bit of the forecasting I would talk about, many of you have called not everything can be forecasted. So it is very important to first identify what is forecastable, what is non-forecastable. And when we have identified the forecastable segments, there also every product profile is different. We have A-class SKUs, high volume, low margin, high volume, high margin, low volume, high margin, low volume, high volume, low margin. So all that 4, but 2x2 metrics which we have. So we need to have different supply chain strategy for each of these matrices. We need to have different forecasting methodology for all these matrices. And that my algorithms will vary. If I have very less demand, I can go for an algorithm like a profit. If I have significant historical data present with me, I can go with the mature, saturated data algorithms. Similarly, for my supply chain strategy, if I have high volume SKUs, I will have distributed network. But if it is a low volume SKU, I will go for a hub and spoke model. So those segmented strategies vary, and I think drilling down on double clicking onto that level helps us to diversify our strategy.
And also we saw that it's done at localities. It doesn't markets which behave very differently. So, one of the fundamental thing to understand is that even if you segment at the aggregate level, it may not work. You need to segment at various levels of geography so that you understand each geography and its dynamic very differently.
Can I describe onto that point, Dr. Rakesh? So, rightly put. So, again, the segmentation on the geography bit when it came to Google mobility, actually, it's one of the external indicators which we use. Now, COVID had every geography, every district was behaving different. The lockdown trajectory was different, the lockdown period was different. And hence, using this Google mobility indicators to create those heat maps and then identify where hoarding pattern will be done. So, jahan pe COVID cases would be about to increase, people will start hoarding, and hence the demand profile would be different. Where the peak has already come and the recovery is going to start, there the demand will start increasing. So all those segmented strategies by looking at a district level, geographically profiling it will help us a lot in demand sensing.
All right, one question from the audience. We are getting out of this time. Yeah.
Question.
Yes,
No, I wanted to just follow up on the ladies' thing. So I think segmentation, great idea, and not just a great idea, it has to be done, and it ties the entire thing together. So we at Mahindra also, we have spares going across the range. So we have to segment our demand, we have to segment our network, and we also have to segment the positioning of where we'll put and what we'll put. So segmentation is fundamental. What I would do want though is that segmentation again can be improved if you employ some machine learning techniques where it takes the bias out of it, because usually what happens is somebody in the organization is experienced enough to say, I think these 4 factors are significant, and so why don't you break them by some Pareto rule or my quartile distribution of 25, 50, 75, 100. Once you've broken it down, then I can put it all together. So avoid that tendency to simplify segmentation. It's a good science, and it can yield very good results. Something which you don't see clusters where you need lower service levels and still make money, but clusters where you need to increase your service levels because you're losing revenue. So all of those insights can come if you employ segmentation well, but aided by technology and tools, because they are much smarter to process a larger number of variables. Don't just go on human intuition when you do segmentation.
So on this pandemic, a lot of things have been talked about, what actually last 2 years we have been seeing that I just wanted to tell one thing, that infrastructure or anything to build up to combat this unfortunate situations in supply chain parlance, I think resilience and agility is the only answer. We can't make additional, to combat all these situations. So, you never know. It's just like people say in colloquial words that they say it's like buying a life policy. The more you have, your age is there and you have a commodity, you have to give more premium. So today's scenario in any of the products, whatever you are selling, we can't build up costs. So to any fact you take into the systems by taking into convenience of that, yes, if something will happen, I have to build the infrastructure or something like that. So it will only add to the fat and it will not, one cannot survive.
One question from the audience, only one.
Hi, my name is Umakan. My question is, in current year we have Russia and Ukraine conflict. Last 2 years were COVID, chip shortage. Before that it was US and China trade war. Before that it was Brexit. Next year it could be China and Vietnam. So every year it looks, we get surprised that outlier or something like that, of that nature, macroeconomic incidence has hit us. But then if we take a step back, it looks like it's normal. Only the maybe the nature or the place of that particular incidence has changed, but it has become normal. So can we forecast those kind of incidences going forward?
That's a good question. In fact, that may be good question for geopoliticians, not for this panel, perhaps, on a lighter note. Yeah, but having said that, so what you're seeing is that a disruption is becoming a way of life for us. Every year, some disruption in some shape or form is actually coming. So if we cannot predict that, at least can we predict some of those effects of those things on the way we conduct our business. And I very completely agree with you, because I work for Sun Pharmaceuticals, and pharma business was one of the most impacted business. When COVID happened, the demand actually shot up like crazy for us, because everybody wanted to hold those medicines, not just about COVID medicines, but also about the BP medicine, the blood sugar medicines, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and it was getting very difficult for us to service all of those. And I do not have an answer for your specific question that can we actually predict any of those. I would love to kind of give it to some other panelists.
Yeah, I can maybe take a stab at that. Yeah. And each one of us would have a different point of view. My point of view is, it's difficult to forecast, or maybe you can predict it, but to forecast, to say what does it mean for you and for your organization in the future, that's where it all boils down to, right? So I think the ability of us to be prepared to manage a situation like this when it comes, I think you talked about scenario modeling, scenario planning, having the ability to quickly come up with your data, come up with what's happening in the external environment, having those AI/ML models and the ability to have causal factors put into your business and see what it makes for your business, what it means, and to be able to generate a scenario and run and talk to your supplier and say, this is what we need. I think that agility a lot of us talked about is what is important, versus predicting what's the next thing, where is the next disruption is going to happen. I think we should be more focusing on when it happens, how do we react to it. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. The other only last point of view, I think we talked a lot about technicalities of forecasting, AI, ML, probabilistic, causal. I think these are all technical things and are needed along with time series, I agree. But I think a very undervalued skill in all of this is the ability to explain that model. The explainability of these factors. We can make it the most complex models by including all this, but if you're not able to explain it, if you're not able to in simple terms tell your supply team, this is why I came up with this number, and this is why you should be using it, we lose the battle. So the ability of explainability is very simple, but it is much needed.
So let me give you an example. Did we predict the semiconductor shortage? No, right? Can we predict something like this? The answer is the signals start to come. You can't predict when it's going to happen, but understand that my opinion is we already know the signals when something is happening in your supply chain. when we started seeing that semiconductor demand is picking up in other parts of the world and for other commodities, guess what? Your lead times for replenishment started to increase. Okay, so that data was evident to you even before you actually were hit by it. If you were using a basic model which uses lead time to hold inventory, you would have immediately found out that suddenly my safety stock is getting higher and higher. Why? Because my supply lead time has become variable. That variability starts to boost your safety stock. So the signals came at least 3 to 6 months before that actual stoppage happened. So it's not like, to the point just made, don't need to predict, but need to be agile enough to respond and be able to build your strategy much before the actual event happens. I think that's key.
Yeah, I'll sort of address that a little bit more specifically, right? I think agility is definitely important, but there has to be a strategic intent about resiliency in your supply chain. 2 examples I'll give you. When the US-China trade war happened, a lot of companies, they kind of were planning for it at a strategic level. I was part of Cisco Systems, a huge high-tech organization, right? Immediately you started to look at how do I build my supply chain strategy with LATAM market in mind from a supply situation, right? Do I reduce my reliance on China? Do I do something in Mexico? Do I do something in Brazil, right? That kind of provides you that resiliency in terms of being then very, very nimble in how you are changing your supply chain map. That's number one. Number two, during COVID, right, there were a lot of organizations that we have worked with. For example, a certain part of the country is hit by the wave, right? Your distribution centers are not working, there is a labor shortage, there are XYZ issues that are happening. You already know what is my second best, third best, fourth best location in terms of how I'm going to service the market. Obviously, you are going to take some service level hit, but it's not as if it's, your entire business is not going topsy-turvy, right? So in terms of building that resiliency I won't say at a tactical level, because at a tactical level it's always the firefighting, right? You are just solving for yesterday's problem. How are you looking at, if an XYZ event happens, right? And, there is a reason why I think Nicholas calls them black swan events. You can only predict as much. Anything could happen tomorrow, right? But then how are you building your resiliency so that you are nimble enough, agile enough to respond to that better than your competition?
I think one thing we all need to do as organization is get comfortable with ranges. I mean, forecast no longer is going to be one absolute number. We have to, equip our supply chain to be comfortable with ranges. And like he said, like Anirudh said, the signals do coming in early, So once those signals start coming in, how do you accelerate or deaccelerate your supply chain outputs is going to tell how well you're going to manage the upcoming crisis.
Just one thought on this prediction of some events like this. I think we often maybe ignore something called as risk management. I think most organizations have this process, but what I've seen is it is mostly done a token assessment, token kind of and that's where I think these two things have to happen together. I'm not really commenting on whether you can predict or not. I think it's more of, let's say, experience and intuition for these kind of events. But we need to also build a very strong risk management strategy. Whether, let's say, a supply disruption, if it happens, how do you sort of have backup plans? Whether your bottom line has enough cushion to absorb what kind of shocks. I mean, these are the things which, as supply chain professionals, we should also focus rather than just because the effort versus impact or benefit on predicting those kind of things accurately. I think it's a very steep curve. I'm not really commenting from data science point of view whether it's possible or not. So given that, I think we have to effectively marry these two things and take the management actions needed for such things. That's my view.
I would love to say yes, we can predict the future, but I don't think most people will agree with me. So I will say maybe not. Okay, we can predict the future. If a country starts shorting trade with another country, if there is army mobilization, of course there is a war going to happen. Forget China, Vietnam, I predict a war between China and India. China is ramping up its air force. But okay, let's assume we cannot predict the future. but we can design our supply chains for our intuitions, right? I would like to narrate a story. When I left tomorrow morning, I didn't check the map. I knew I was going to reach within 10 to 15 minutes. I live in Villepale East. The traffic, the signals, the route I'll take, I have those data. I use my intuition and I reach there in 10 to 15 minutes.
All right, I think we come to the end of this. Interesting forecast, not to forecast. We can forecast everything and we cannot forecast everything is, I think, is the right statement. First, I think on some summary of what we just can't build resilience everywhere. We have to have a complete business continuity program for any ramp up of military, any pandemic or any disruption climate based. Businesses do not build up this particular first level of resilience. Look at tsunami in Japan. Ford has to stop its manufacturing for 3 weeks. You know why? In one of their 10,273 tires, there was a chip which was not available, which affected only 2% of their business. Gone. You need to have this visibility. And if you have visibility with satellite, I think I agree with Sanmukh there, that you can see the ramp up, you can be prepared. Probability of it happening or not happening is unknown. But if it happens, you have an amazing business resilience plan or business continuity plan and process. The first is business continuity, second is resilience, third is forecast. And build the resilience. In fact, people say, what is resilience? Resilience is nothing but agility and visibility. How do you bring agility? You need to know what needs to move, right? And that's where the forecast is. Thank you very much.